Well, good morning. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm so pleased to talk with you about the topic that is the topic of the day, isn't it? Our shifting demographics and what does it mean for America's future. We just came off a pretty amazing election. I was not breathing for a whole 24-hour period. It was very stressful. But what has been so interesting is to see the headlines around the country. Brookings says, on Election Day, a new American mainstream. The New York Times, demographic shift brings new worry for Republicans. The Wall Street Journal, vote data show changing nation. And Bill O'Reilly on Fox simply declared, traditional America is dead. It really is interesting to see that something that has been coming so steadily for so long caught America so unawares. It is just so interesting to see how that plays out. It seems that for many, many, many years now, as a nation, we have been nostalgic for a time that never was, while avoiding a future that was inevitable. That's exactly what we were doing. And I say nostalgic for a time that never was, because when people think about, oh, how nice it used to be when the public schools were just great, when nobody ever had to worry about locking their doors. Wasn't it great when everybody had a job? I mean, we're nostalgic for those kind of times, and that never existed. It never existed. When these public schools were so great, there were so many children who weren't even in school, children who were picking lettuce in the fields, children who were working in sweatshops and school never even came up, children who were too poor to be able to go to school, black children in Mississippi where the entire span of children who were in school were in one room with a dirt floor. Children in cities were in school perhaps, but nobody expected them to learn. They were in the back of the room and forgotten. Nostalgic for a time that never was, because people were just thinking about one part of America. While avoiding a future that is inevitable, the changing demographics have been changing for a long time, and if people had been getting out and looking around, they would have seen that something was definitely changing. Now, it's a wonderful thing. This is such a lucky country. It gets gifts every time it turns around. Gifts sometimes that it doesn't even deserve. At the very moment when the whole world is about difference and diversity and crossing lines, when we're in a global economy, when we're at a point where democracy, if it has anything to be proud of, will be that it works beyond a homogeneous society, that it works in a context of difference. At the very time when these are the big questions that the nation and the world faces, we have become a world nation. We have become a world nation on a stage in which that has huge currency. But let me just stop and make sure that we all know just how much we've changed. It's really quite an exciting story. By 2042 or so, we will be a nation in which the majority are people of color, Native American, Asian, Pacific Islander, Latino, African American. You see that in 1970, 83% of the population of the United States was white. You see by 2050 that it'll be 45%. 2040, it'll be 50%. So the projection is that just about 2042, the majority of people in the United States of America will be people of color. And many people think Because we all know that the big push in the changing demographics is being really driven by the Latino population, that's all about immigration. It is not. It is not. It is people being born here. In Los Angeles and all the cities that you think about, the growth that you're seeing in the Latino population, second and third generation. And this is why. Here's the median age. You see, for people who are Latino, it is 27. For people who are white, it is 41. And so we know that this is going to continue to be the case, that we're going to see these shifting demographics. And so what we're seeing is this real racial generation gap. In 1975, 87% of the nation was white, of those over 65, and those who were under 18, 75%. But you see how that has grown. Another way to look at this last column is 80% of those over 65 are white, and 46% of children under 18 in this country are of color. In California, 73% of all children under 18 are of color. 73%. Here's a look at where we are now. The shaded areas represent different gradations of communities in which you have large percentages of people of color. The darkest orange is 50% or more. And then you have the 40% and then the 30%. This is what it looks like when you ask who's of color 65 plus, and the other is who's of color 0 to 4. Now that 0 to 4 map, I want to let that stay up there for a moment, because I'm going to run now a series of maps from 1980 to 2040. And you will see that that map that's 0 to 4 is going to get recreated. That is the entire population of the United States in 2040. It looks a lot like the 0 to 4 map today, and wouldn't you expect that it would? So that is what the country will look like when we become a nation in which the majority are people of color. It is a good thing. It is a good thing that the country is positioned to be able to be a world nation, when a world nation is the nation that is going to be able to not only be competitive in a global economy, but going to relate to the world as it is. At PolicyLink, we were anticipating this. We were anticipating that we would get to a point more rapidly than anyone thought in which the majority of people in the nation would be people of color. And we recognized that when that happened, it would mean a lot for the agenda that we have been working on with partners all across the country for a very long time. Because that agenda is one of how do you build a fully inclusive society in which all can participate and prosper. That's our mission at PolicyLink, to advance policies that achieve economic and social equity. How do you have just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential? So as we have thought about the shifting demographics and the things that we have been trying to do to build this inclusive society, it was becoming very apparent to us that this equity agenda that we have been pushing, trying to make sure that all children start school ready to learn, enter schools that actually help them to learn, to grow, to reach their full potential, to graduate, to go on to careers, to reach their full potential in terms of contributions and the way that they live their lives. The equity agenda that had us looking at communities, because so many people in this nation who are being left behind live in places that have been left behind. They live in places where the schools are failing them, places that are not safe, where the housing is inadequate, but even more frightening, places where there are no jobs and no natural job networks. How did you get your first job? You knew somebody. You knew somebody. Maybe you just knew your daddy, But maybe it was the next door neighbor. Maybe it was somebody in the neighborhood who said, come go here. Natural job networks, that's how people get into work. If you live in a community without one, you're at a disadvantage. People who live in communities without public transit to connect them to opportunity in the region. We've become a place in which where you live in America is a proxy for opportunity. Where you live determines access to everything. It even determines how long you live. In the Bay Area where I live, people who live in the Berkeley Hills live on average 10 to 15 years longer than people who live in the West Oakland Flatlands, a distance of maybe 3 miles. Where you live not only determines how long you live, but how well you live while you live. Addressing all of that has been part of our equity work. As we have looked at the shifting demographics, it's become pretty obvious that this equity work that means everything to the people who are being left behind has become something that means everything to the nation. Because to the degree that we get equity right, we get America right. Whether we're talking about a vast and sustainable middle class, whether we're talking about being competitive in a global economy, whether we're talking about a robust democracy, whether we're talking about being able to use our space and our environment in a way that is setting us up for a future where we're not going to have the kind of calamities constantly happening that we just had here in New York. Dealing with climate change depends on what we do about equity. We're going to get climate change right. You all know how to do this in New York. You use public transit. You have lots of people all across the country who don't use it. And I will tell you, we will not be a nation that uses public transit to the degree that we have to until we get comfortable sitting next to the other. Getting equity right even determines climate change, what we do about climate change. And so the equity agenda has become America's agenda. What does it mean for what we all have to do? I'm happy to talk to people who are thinking about governance. I know the first time that I joined a board, how surprised I was, because I was invited to join a national board that was doing work that I was very excited about. And when I was asked to join, and it was interesting, that was my very first board experience. When I was asked to join, I kind of had a notion that I was going to be doing the work of the organization, that I was going to be doing what I associated with, how it presented itself to the public. And it was a real education for me to understand what trustees really do, what governance is really about, how our role is often one making sure that the organization is financially healthy, making sure that it's anticipating what's going on in the broader world, making connections, making sure that people are paying attention to the organizational issues that create the health that is so important. Bringing the right kind of governance to an organization is every bit as important as how it's seen up front. And when you think about the shifting demographics, when we think about what we have to do to not just have a little diversity, but to capture the power of who we are, to capture the power of who we are. It's so important that we not just think about doing something that makes us look different when the public sees us, but that we're transforming ourselves culturally. We're transforming ourselves in terms of how we think. That our natural going forward, the bouquet of who we are, so represents what the world is, that the new decision-making comes more easily, that it has a whole different connection to the world. When I think about the issues that you work on, I must say, I know that what you do is so essential for the things that I'm talking about. Because as we think about how do we be the nation that we are, it is so important that it permeate everything. It is most important that it permeate our culture, because it's our culture that often helps us to be able to see our best, to be our best, and to understand ourselves. I had this experience as a little girl. I grew up in a segregated St. Louis, Missouri in the 1950s and the early 60s. And my parents were from North Carolina, and I wasn't even born in St. Louis, but by the time I was an infant, we were there. So I feel like that was my entire growing up. It was. But we lived in the black community in St. Louis. We lived in the black community, and it was all black. The places where we prayed and played and volunteered and went to school, it was all black. But it hadn't started out that way. Ours was the second black family to move into our house on the 4900 block of Terry in St. Louis, Missouri. The first having moved in the day before. And I always knew growing up that we had to be a powerful family, because our moving on that block caused all the white people to move out. Now, you know, that takes a lot of power just to be able to step into a place and to cause everybody else to sell their homes and to move out. I often tell the story that way, and it's not a completely true story, because there was one family that did not move, lived across the street. And what was so interesting is that they had a daughter who was exactly my age. Was a very little girl, adored dolls. Actually, a lot of girls don't like dolls. That's a myth, isn't it? But so I was happy to find a little girl who did really love to play with dolls, and we immediately bonded. She had an attic, and we used to have a whole fantasy world going on up in that attic. We were great friends. However, the schools were segregated. She went to the lovely schoolhouse on the corner, and my brother and I went to a school about 6 or 8 blocks away, because that was the black school. In 1954, when Brown versus Board of Education happened, I can remember, even though we were little girls, you know, I mean, we were in the 2nd grade, maybe 1st grade, we were little girls. I can remember how happy we were. Somehow, in both of our households, we knew what Brown versus Board of Education meant, and I can remember grabbing hands and doing a little jig about we were going to the same school in the fall. Well, the fall came. I did go to the school on the corner. She did not. She was bused to the suburbs, and the school that had been all white in June was all black in September. I never spoke to her again. Never spoke to her again. She continued to live across the street. Her parents died living across the street. But I never spoke to her again. We never had any contact. In 1955, a year later, I'm still a little girl, somewhere south of 10. I was not even 10 years old. My parents brought me to New York City, and they took me to see A Raisin in the Sun. First play I ever went to. My first theater experience. Now, I grew up in a very middle-class home. Parents, well-educated. On my mother's side, educated for generations, which was an unusual thing in that context. And everything was very proper in my household. Nobody ever screamed. I didn't hear about whatever the problems were going on. The black middle class created a cocoon for black middle class children. I mean, we were completely surrounded by caring adults. And not only was my whole world black, but that wasn't enough for these caring adults. They wanted us to experience the best St. Louis had. And so they would take us to the outdoor opera. They would take us to the museum. But we would be surrounded by the adults, protected from the sting and burn of racism. So that even though I was growing up in a segregated St. Louis, Missouri, I must say I didn't experience the racism that I know was stark there, except for what I'm telling you about what happened across the street, which was a personal affront. I didn't speak to her again because I knew that I had personally been rejected. Then I go to see A Raisin in the Sun. And I see a family interacting in ways that were more volatile than anything I had ever seen in a household. I saw something being played out that put my powerful black family, having caused all these people to leave us in this wonderful neighborhood, in a different context, as I saw the story that was unfolding there. And I was able to understand what had happened when that little girl across the street got bused to the suburbs in a way that made it even deeper than it had been when it was just personal. It helped me to understand what was happening to me as a black person, as a black child, less than 10 years old, to experience the theater. We need to understand so much about who we are right now. And it won't happen if we can't figure out how to be transformed We have to be transformed. What I'm getting at is, as you think about what to do with these demographics, Teresa, would you hand me my glass of water there? As you think about what to do with these demographics, you are going to, it's in the glass. The glass of water. Thank you. As you think about what it is you want to do, you have to not only think about how we want to show something different, something more inclusive. We also have to think about how to transform our institutions, how to transform our culture, how to be sure at every level that we're not just thinking about who we are as a nation, but that it's going to come naturally to reflect it because we're transforming ourselves. Let me just talk about myself for a moment as the leader of a national policy organization. You do not see many people of color, let alone people of color who are women, who lead the nation's national policy organizations. You just don't. You just don't. The only reason that I do is because I was able to see, as being the vice president of the Rockefeller Foundation, how it is that you build these things. So the diversity within the Rockefeller Foundation that had me there as the senior vice president gave me a view about how to do something that most people would not have had who would have been of color in thinking about how to do this, just being there. Nobody had a tutorial for me. I was just there. I could have gone to 1,000,000 lectures about it, and they would have never had the impact of being there, doing it, and seeing it. Because I am the leader of the organization, our agenda has always been slightly different. And I have been more tenacious about that agenda because it's not academic for me, it's not flavor of the month for me, it is fundamental to what I understand about my own being, about the people who I see constantly. Because I was in the position of being the leader, we have a board of directors that is different. It is different, it is diverse, it is inclusive. They are people who get it in a very fundamental sense. And we have been together for so long that we can bring on people for whom the conversations might be new, and they will get it in a deeper sense immediately. We have a staff at PolicyLink that hovers around 70 people. Many of them are young people, and our staff is very diverse. It is white, it is black, it is Latino, it is Asian, it is men, it is women. It is very diverse. And the young people who come in are getting a real education every single day because of the sensibilities and the experiences of people who are there. It has led to us having a policy agenda that leads with equity, that defines equity in some fundamental ways, that really understands the aspirations of the shifting demographics, that people don't think of those shifting demographics in our organization as a problem. We see it as being full of aspiration. We understand that what the nation needs to do, all those things I talked about, education, jobs, middle class, building community, the people who are the shifting demographics have skin in the game of achieving that. It's not just something that would be good to have. It's not just a good moral thing to produce. Their lives and the lives of their children depend on those things happening. And we're able to take those aspirations and connect them to policy agendas and advocacy and move forward. And so as you think about your continuing conversation, I want you to think about how do you begin to be the nation that we are even as we're emerging? How do we bring in the voices, enough of them, enough authenticity, enough sense of comfort and power, enough space and enough care to be able to make sure that people know their voice is important, that they know their voice is important. I can't tell you how many rooms I've been in where people have asked me in because they wanted diversity. I can't tell you how many rooms I've been in where I've been the only person of color. I always say to people, I've never been in a room where there were no people of color, because if I was there, there was at least one. But I can't tell you how many times I've been the only one. And the times when it has been so difficult for me to speak. I'm not shy, and I often quickly know what I want to say, but so often it's so clear that people don't want to hear it. They were happy when I came to the table. Job done. We're diverse now. We're diverse now. Okay? Or to speak, and then it's as if you didn't. To speak and then have the conversation go on as if you did not say a word until one of the white people in the room says it, and everybody says that is a brilliant idea. And you wonder, was I not loud enough? Was I not clear enough? What was the problem when I said it? I can't tell you how many rooms I've been in, and when I've spoken, the reaction has been one of, oh, what could we possibly do about that? What could we, you have just taken us into a realm that is fantasy, that cannot be dealt with. And so creating spaces in which people know that their voices are needed, in which what people say actually begins to transform the conversation that's happening, being willing to make yourself as uncomfortable as we have often made the other. As we have often made the other. And so you have to go through that struggle. And it's going to be fun. It's going to be challenging. It's going to be frustrating. But in the end, everybody is going to learn. Everybody is going to learn. Because just as this economy is not going to be an economy that's going to sustain this nation if we can't tap the workforce that is tomorrow. If we can't tap the entrepreneurial spirit that's needed for tomorrow, if we can't capture the creativity and innovation that vibrant economies need, America will not be competitive in this global economy if the people who are going to be the future are not prepared to lead the future in the right directions. Democracy will not flourish if the people who are going to depend on a vibrant democracy don't feel it in multiple ways beyond voting. The voting was really something. It was really something. The reason that people are so amazed is interesting because President Obama did not get the majority of the white vote the first time. But somehow having it happen a second time, having him get even less of the white vote and get pushed over the line. 39% of the white vote he got, but pushed over the line by 93% of the black vote, which is 13% of the electorate. 71% of the Latino vote, which is 10% of the electorate. 73% of the Asian vote, which is 3% of the electorate. That combined with the white people who did vote for him, the young people, the women, the men, that made the difference. People really have to understand that it's got to be about more than voting. It's not just voting, it's voting this time. But if we're not transforming the choices, if we're not transforming the policy agenda, if we're not transforming the way people live in community, having voice on their transit system, on their school board, on their economic development councils, we will not be investing in the base of democracy. And the cultural piece of it is the essential piece. It's how we learn about ourselves. It's how we see ourselves. It's how we tell ourselves a different narrative about who we are. That's up to you. You're going to have fun getting there. You're going to have a great time. Thank you. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that. I'm told that we have time for conversation and questions. And I'd love to be in conversation with you.
Great. If you could just raise your hand, please, and we'll come to you at the microphone. Do you have a question?
I have a question.
Hi.
Your little neighbor, the little girl, I have a feeling you think about her often. How do you think her life is?
Oh, I wish I knew. I think about her so often. Her name was Marion. Her name was Marion. I didn't think about her for many a year, though. It's interesting. I went through, that happened. I went through elementary school, went through high school, went away to college, got married, had a baby, went to law school, been practicing law for a couple of years, and got invited to the Aspen Institute for one of their executive sessions. And I was one of the not-for-profit people who just gets invited to be able to, add color and interest to the conversation. And in a conversation that we were having, my husband was there with me. I don't know why, but I told that story. At the end of that story, all the people in the room were weeping. And my husband and I, we went back to our room, and he said, I never knew that story. Can you believe the impact it had on everybody? I said, I was totally shocked by it. Totally shocked by it. But that was a number of years ago now, well over 20 years. And I've been telling it a lot ever since. I've written about it. And I bet you it changed Marion. Because we were best friends, and it had happened to her based on her parents' decision. It wasn't her decision, and she had had to suffer by it, and I'm sure she understood it even less well than I understood it. And at some point in her life, she probably came to understand it, or not. But I wish that I knew what happened to Marion. It would be so cool to hook up with her. Thanks for that question. I'm sure if I wanted to find her, I could find her. So I haven't wanted it enough, but you may be pushing me in that direction. Yeah.
Hi, and thank you. I'm Michael Masser from the Huntington Theater. A related question, which is, when you got that glass of water from Teresa, did you think it was half empty, or did you think it was half full? And so,
no question, half full for me,
right,
always.
That's what I thought. And so I'm interested in something, which is that we operate on two planes. We operate on a strategic plane, right? We have goals, which are kind of broad, and we probably could each summarize the institutional goal that relates to our diversity agendas. And then we really operate in minutia, in one person at a time, one strategy at a time, one tactic at a time. I'm just interested in hearing you talk about the balance between those things and how one supports the other as it relates to our specific theaters.
Well, I certainly understand your question completely. As it relates to your specific theater groups, I can only tell you from my context, and maybe you can translate it to your context. I do not pretend to know your context well. At PolicyLink, our big goal is to create a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential to achieve equity. We know that it involves multi-sectors. Hannah and I were just talking about the interrelationship of everything. You've got to get that interrelationship. It's not just health or education or housing or jobs or transportation. They all interact, have an impact one on the other. We understand that at PolicyLink. And we have to understand that and hold on to it at the same time that we disaggregate the situation, understand each strand, identify the ones where opportunity exists, move on that opportunity, try to be successful, and when we are successful, try to frame it and talk about it in ways that weave it back into the whole. For us, a classic example of that is that one of the great inequities in this country is that if you are poor and black and living in a poor black community, you have a difficult time buying a tomato in your neighborhood. There are no fresh fruits and vegetables in low-income black communities across this country. Only 8% of African Americans live in a census tract with a grocery store. Only 8%. We know that the absence of easy access to fresh fruits and vegetables contributes to heart disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity. They're all interrelated. And so we can go from imagining a society in which all are reaching their full potential to identifying a strategy of getting more grocery stores in underserved communities. We identified it, we worked on it, we've had huge success. If you go on our website, policylink.org, you'll read more about it than you ever would want to know. But we have told that story in a way that we relate it back to health, well-being, equity and inclusion. And it's important for us at PolicyLink to talk about it that way. We spend more time talking at PolicyLink with our staff than people really like. They want less of it. They want to get to their work. What they don't completely understand is that only through this constant dialogue about how what we're doing specifically relates to what we're trying to do in the big way does it relate. Because if you work on them and you don't understand the interrelationship, you don't keep doing the things that weave them together. Now, in your context, I'm sure you have your own stories, but you have to constantly be doing it, but do it in a way that is self-conscious and is reinforcing and keeps to build a broader narrative.
Hi, Bruce Cohen from, LARC. I think we've been hearing it all week, but for me, you really crystallized, if these numbers are correct, which they probably are, this extraordinary fact that it's 2012 now, and the entire balance of this country as we know it, from being a majority white country to a majority people of color country, is going to switch in 2042. So that's 30 years. And that 30-year period has never happened before in the history of the world, and it's never going to happen again. So it seemed, I got excited hearing you speak. That seems spot on to the mission of this weekend. Is perhaps another way of looking at what we're starting the conversation of is, what does theater want to look like in these 30 years, in this one-of-a-kind transition period? And was just wondering if you had any advice for us as we start this journey of such a big question. How do we start to frame what should be accomplished in this 30-year period?
I think that the answers definitely exist. What I have found in my own work is that if you want to have a national policy that's really forward-thinking, if you look to local communities, you'll find the kernels and the ingredients of what the elements are that need to be there. Our tagline at PolicyLink is lifting up what works, because we believe that in communities all across this country, the best ideas have already been created. I believe that local leaders are national leaders. They're solving the nation's problems. So we need to shine a bright light on them and what they're doing, learn from it, respect it, see it as the innovation for the future, and help to put it on steroids to help get there more quickly with more. I've seen it happening in theater, in the arts, in culture, as people have been involved in partnerships around economic development, around community building, around placemaking. We're involved in a project with Intersection for the Arts in San Francisco, where we're really looking at how San Francisco is becoming a hub for high tech. The Silicon Valley is kind of shifting to San Francisco. And as that's happening, new opportunities are going to get created in some of the very locations in the San Francisco Bay Area that have been the most left behind, because that's where the close-in housing is. That's where people are going to want to live. That's where you have buildings that have been abandoned that are big enough for what's needed. That's where you have this kind of vibrancy that the high-tech movement is looking to be around. And so working with the Intersection for the Arts, they're really saying, how do we bring culture into placemaking to begin to help the people who live there see themselves in the new environment, help people who are coming in to see the value and the assets that are already there. And I think that kind of work is happening in cultural communities, in communities all across the country. And if we step back and look at those who don't have much in the way of resources, for whom venue doesn't define what it is that they do, those of you who are lucky enough to have venues, those of you who are lucky enough to have resources, will see the innovations that will help to transform and connect you more to what the future will be. And so that would be my answer. Go local, look what the innovators are doing in local community, because they're the answers that when you put them on speed up will help us to be ready for our future when we get there.
Good morning. My name is Akiba Abaka. I'm a director and a young leader of color. My question is, as a storyteller, I like to think about the social consciousness of change. As I look at these numbers as to what America will look like in 2042, how do we lead with equity in shifting the social or collective consciousness of the current demographic?
That is so interesting, because I talk about that a lot. Many of the people I talk to within the policy world, within politics, within philanthropy, about the shifting demographics, the urgency of the equity agenda, often want to channel my speech into a direction that will speak to people who are not there yet. They want to know, will this conversation play with the Republicans? Will this conversation play with business leaders in America? Will this conversation be comfortable for white people who are feeling very good about themselves and will be made uncomfortable about this thing that you're talking about? And so the PR people and the communication specialists are always trying to get me not to use the words that I've used with you today. And I push back because I believe two things. One gets to your question, that we need for the people who are going to be the future to become self-conscious about their role, their responsibilities, their moment. We need for the people who are going to make up the future to begin to see themselves as America, with all of the obligations of Americans to country, to neighbor, that be able to set the tone, the moral tone, the tone of generosity, the tone of placemaking, of being. And so I often try to say, I'm looking for the language that will capture the attention of the people who are going to be the leaders. And I have found that this conversation is really resonating, because many of you might not know this, but for the most part, when people of color come together and start building coalition, they start building it based on a story of common oppression. That is a depressing place to start. That is a depressing place to start. That if our only coming together has to start from a place of common oppression, that often leads to them bickering about whose oppression has been worse, it's not very productive. But to begin to come together about a role in the future, one of leadership, one of creation, one of innovation, it's much more energizing. And while you can't forget your journey, the journey is important. The nation needs to remember the journey, and people need to remember their journeys. The journey is important, but the journey is important for understanding where you're going. Not just where you've been, but where you're going. And so I'm finding that this is really working well. And I think that for people who are looking for the new narrative that includes us all, I like to put it in these ways, because I think there are so many people who want to be a part of this world that I'm dreaming about. So many people who want to be a part of it, just as there were so many people who were white, who were energized and transformed by being a part of the civil rights movement. Again, I was a child. In its heyday, I actually came out of college into the Black Power movement, not the Civil Rights movement. But I have, because of my good friend Marion Wright Edelman, been completely exposed to so many people who were in the Civil Rights movement. And as I have sat with them, I have been impressed how transformative it was for white people, both who were in it and who identified with it. And so I'm also speaking beyond communities of color. And so the answer to your question is, I think this plays very well, and that we should continue to explore your question. Because I do not claim to have the answer. I only know that new language, new narrative, new sense of what the possibilities are, a possibility that doesn't just have a place for you, but a possibility that will not be realized if you are not there helping to create it. Right? So, yes, you're right on. Are we at the end of time?
Hello? Oh, hi.
Okay. We have one here, okay, and here.
Hi. All right. My name is Armando Molina. I'm Artistic Director of Company of Angels. And this question comes from my wife in Los Angeles, actually, who heard you speak when she was a Berkeley law student a number of years ago. And the thing that you've started to unpack some of what this question sort of connects to, and maybe she apologizes ahead of time, that it might be asked in a more stark way, and it's about whether or not the question is about power and power sharing and sharing of resources. I thought you spoke earlier about being in a room where everyone says this is like a fantasy. So is that the fantasy? And how would you address the question from that stark point of view?
Well, it is about power. It is about agency. I mean, I don't think you ever want to walk away from that. It is about power and it is about agency. That the world that we can imagine is one that is different because people have the power to make it different. And what we haven't understood for a long time in this nation is that long ago we passed the moment when, in the words of Jean-Luc Picard, Captain Jean-Luc Picard, make it so. I can see we got a lot of Trekkies in the room. They remember he used to say that, make it so. We have not been a nation for a long time in which people could just say, make it so. They didn't have that kind of power. And we need to have the power that is shared and real so that together we can make something different. And so this is not about one group overpowering another, but it is about being able to develop the economic power, the political power, the civic power, the cultural power to be able to together create something new. It will not happen from a benevolent approach. It will not. Something different could happen because someone who has some power says, let's do something different. But to have the authenticity that will make it real, it has to come from shared power. We have to co-create. And the reason I say lots of people think it's a fantasy is because for many people in this country, we're still at a very infant stage in terms of getting comfortable with the other. Very infant stage. There are a lot of people who are not comfortable talking to people of a different race. And so they cannot imagine co-creating, co-power. There are a lot of people who carry a lot of misinformation and guilt, and they worry that co-power will soon be overpower, and that there's so much bitterness that overpower is going to be punitive and is going to hurt and going to exclude. It's a fantasy because people are in such infantile, uninformed, and sometimes hostile places that they cannot imagine that we can become this place that I'm talking about. And I think that our history suggests that we can. Our history suggests that we can. We have a history of really doing the no one expected that you would do that. We are, no one expected that you would do that nation, and we can do this. And I don't think this is going to be the most difficult thing that we've ever done either. But we've got to commit to doing it, and everybody has to commit to doing it. And everybody has to commit to taking a look at yourself, at your institution, at your boards, at your committees, every room that you sit in. I often ask the question when I'm sitting in a room, because I try to have everybody's back. I often say this. It is my desire to be a person that if I am in the room, you know your back is covered. Whether you are a person with disabilities, or you're Latino, or you're gay, whatever it might be, if I'm in the room, your back is covered. And I have to say that I fail at it every day. I don't fail at it every day because I don't try. I fail at it because I can't do that. I cannot have your experience so authentically in me that I know that I would do what you would do. But if we at least ask, what would make this room authentic? What would help the thing that I'm trying to do to really be done well? We'll be there. We'll be there having fun. I mean, when I say having fun, I am not being funny. I think that it will be fun to open ourselves up to ask those questions and work in those ways. I suspect this is the last question. Yes, I know it is the last question now.
Thank you very much. I lived and worked in Asia for about 25 years, and after a long time, I learned that if I think I could predict a person's behavior based on the group they belong to, that I limit my ability to know that person as a person. But it took quite a while, and I still need to learn that. But what you said about St. Louis resonated with me because I grew up on a farm in Missouri, which is probably even more isolated. I never saw an Asian until I went to university. Didn't have an opportunity to see people who were different from myself. And I remember while I was at university, the first black student came, and they brought him in the summer so it wouldn't be so disruptive. But I can still see him sitting there all by himself, nobody talking to him, and I felt so sorry for him, but never went over to say hello. But my question, which I'll try to put simply, have you always felt the glass is full, or have you been through evolutions to get to be the great leader that you are today?
Thank you for that. It's always been full for me. And I've thought about that because I'm a happy person. And I used to think I was a happy person because nothing bad ever happened to me. And I used to think, boy, it's easy to be a happy person when nothing bad ever happens to you. And I grew up really being fascinated by writing. I love to read. I love fiction. And I thought I might be a writer. And I've written things, but they haven't been fiction. You know, I've been writing about poverty and stuff like that. And I've often thought that one of the reasons that I did not become the fiction writer is because I had such a happy childhood that I thought maybe I needed, you know, a few bad things to happen to me to be able to really pull it out. It's kind of silly, huh? But at any rate, I can no longer say that nothing bad has happened to me, and I'm still a happy person. And it's caused me to understand that that sense of being happy and being optimistic, I don't know if you're born with it, or I don't know if it's something that happens early on in childhood, but if you have it, you're lucky. I recently read the book Thinking Fast and Slow. I don't know if any of you have read that. And one of the things that the author says in there, he says, if you wish but one thing for your child, wish them to be an optimist. And he said that it doesn't keep them from being foolish or making mistakes or any of that, but they'll just keep trying. They'll just keep trying, and they'll just keep getting up and dusting themselves off. And that ability is what often leads you to achieve. So the answer to your question is I've always been an optimistic person, but I try, because I know I am optimistic, I'm always testing myself against reality. I know I'm optimistic, and I don't want to be Pollyanna. I think that that sense of being optimistic and thinking about what can happen, it often inspires people. You can get them to follow you. You can get people to do something different. So I think it brings with it an obligation to always be testing your optimism against reality. And on this one, I'm testing, and I think I'm right. Thank you.